So, Peter Turchin, welcome.
Thank you.
You have written a book called End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration. So, some of you may know, we had Nouriel Roubini a couple of months ago discussing his book, Mega Threats. And although this book is different, it bears a kind of family resemblance to a body of work that may variously be termed the polycrisis, or the study of the ways in which multiple crises layer upon each other and compound their impact. And you have referred to yourself, I think, as a collapsologist.
No, in fact, I made a very strong effort to distance myself from collapsology. I say I'm not a collapsologist because what is collapse? And it sounds very dire. Everybody has a different idea of collapse.
So you've been accused of being a collapsologist, and today's conversation is going to be showing why you're not.
Mistakenly, termed as collapsologist.
Excellent. Okay, glad we got that one out of the way. Let's start by talking about cliodynamics. It's at the core of your work and your discipline, something that you have worked upon, pioneered. Tell us what cliodynamics is.
Well, think about it. Our societies spend a huge amount of money on medical research, right, because we want to be in good health. Also, I used to be a biologist, and we studied ecology, and we want to have our ecosystems to be healthy. But how come we spend so little money on studying the health of our societies? And so I claim that in order for us to understand why our societies behave in ways they do, and often surprise us. In fact, when we start talking about end times, typically they come, for most of the population, they are a huge surprise, often unpleasant one. All right, so how come we don't have a good science of our societies? And in order for this science to be able to capture the trajectories of societies, it has to be historical science, because we now know that deep roots of all kinds of things exist. If you don't know where you came from, and where you came from could be not just 20 years ago, it could be 100 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, you need to study history. So what I claim is we need a science of history that would enable us to understand where we came from, why we are either in a good state or bad state, and also how do we nudge our trajectories of our societies to go in positive directions rather than negative directions.
Okay, but as I understand your work, it's not just a societal health check. One of your core arguments, and we're going to come back to this question of the predictiveness of your work, is that you posit, and I quote, that there is an alternation of integrative and disintegrative phases in societies lasting for roughly a century, and there's some quibbles about whether monogamous or polygamous societies are 100 or 200 years. But essentially, you say that societies both integrate and disintegrate over this period of a century. So tell us a little bit of why you've gone from a health check to seeking to take that health check to make predictions about the direction of travel in societies.
So integrative phases, they are characterized by internal peace and order, although, of course, at the same time, societies keep external wars going, oftentimes wars of conquest. So you're focusing here on what's happening inside of the society. And these are healthy periods, because during those periods, there is little internal violence, and also the well-being of, especially during the beginning of the integrative phases, the well-being of general population tends to increase. And when these integrative phases come, social breakdown, political fragmentation in the fighting, often we'll talk a bit more that there are many different trajectories that can follow from the crisis, right? But many of these trajectories involve bloody civil wars, social revolutions, and things like that. And that is what I would say unhealthy periods of societies. And so the question becomes, how can we extend, and maybe how we can extend the integrative phases, and maybe how can we abolish those periods of these integrative phases, which is like a disease or even death of an organism.
Okay, so if your argument is that after roughly a century, a series of things happen which give us early warning signs that we're about to enter a disintegrative phase, and kind of spoiler alert for this audience, the disintegrative, are we on an integrative or a disintegrative arc of history right now, according to your work?
In the United States, we have certainly entered the disintegrative period.
All right.
I think it became very abundantly clear on January 6th of 2021, if not before.
Okay. So the moment in which the President of the United States, who had lost an election, encouraged and arguably led an insurrection against the electoral results, was the beginnings of the signs of disintegration occurring, but a set of things that occurred prior to that that should have been early warning signs.
Yes, so let me just add that, in fact, since I published a forecast in 2010, the signs that the society was developing, the trends were developing in the wrong direction were abundantly clear by 2010 and maybe even 1990s if I had the apparatus to understand that. So it's just when I was giving talks about this research, you know, I could see people were very skeptical and they were thinking, oh, guy, this is a mad guy. So what's he talking about?
Okay, so in 2010, you called the beginning of a disintegrative phase. So let's go through the kind of four, I mean, you may have your own, but the four warning signs of that disintegrative phase. And the first one is what you call popular immiseration. So talk us through what that is.
Sure. So the four ones, just to give a preview, is declining living standards for the general population, which the technical term is immiseration. The second, even more important, and I hope you spend more time on it, is elite overproduction. The state weakness is the third one, and then depending on how large and powerful the country is, external influences can also play a role. So let's start by talking with immiseration, because here what I use, the concept that I use in the book, I call it the wealth pump. All right, so it's the perverse wealth pump that at some points it gets turned on and it starts pumping income and wealth from the general population, workers or even peasants, for example, in medieval societies, and delivers this wealth to the elites. So why does this happen, and why does the wealth pump sometimes is working and sometimes is not working? And so the answer that we discovered by doing this analysis, and I should mention also that we have now nearly 200 cases of historical societies going into crisis and then emerging from it, which gives us a pretty good database to run some statistical analysis. So the generic thing that tends to happen is that when you are in the middle of an integrative phase, the elites get relaxed. They think that life is going to be good for everybody, and then they start reconfiguring the economy in such a ways that they direct more and more of the fruits of the economy to themselves. They become selfish elites. Why? Well, because they can. All right? It's known, actually, there is a term for it, the iron law of oligarchy. People are tempted to translate their power into, good things for themselves. All right, so what that does then, it leads to, especially in societies where there is no economic growth, like in medieval times or the modern times, this leads to absolute immiseration of the population. All right, in more modern societies, actually, once this wealth pump gets working very hard, what happens, like in the United States, for example, the pump was turned on during the 1970s, all right? You may have seen this graph of how worker productivity goes like this over the past century, and the worker wages go like this until 1970s, and boom, go like this, and even now are declining. So all of that extra wealth was pumped somewhere, all right? And that's led to immiseration. So United States immiseration has taken, when I first discovered these trends in 2010, I wrote that, of course, we don't expect Malthusian, effects like the biological immiseration would lead to a shortened lifespans, or one proxy that we use to capture immiseration in the past is the height, because you can get the average population height from skeletons, all right? That's how we know there are these cycles, all right? And then I was shocked when in 2017, suddenly the life expectancy of Americans not only stopped growing, it actually declined, and it kept declining even before COVID. So this is, what does immiseration really mean? It's people sort of tend to shrink away from this word. It seems such a hard word, but it is real immiseration. In the United States, again, this is the country that I know from the inside, both because I live there and because I have tons of data. In the United States, the 60% of the population who have no college degrees, right, their life expectancies actually started to decline even before 2017. You may be familiar with the idea of death of despair, all right? So that's, that hit about 20 years ago. It became noticeable. And these are, the deaths of despair are suicide, the death from alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and also it is often followed by increased, vehicle fatalities and things like that, because people just don't care about their lives anymore. So this is what immiseration is like at the individual level.
Okay. I'm going to pause for a moment because I think the detail on this particular point matters. If your argument is that there's an iron law of oligarchy, that elites accrete wealth to themselves because they can, that presupposes that a series of measures and laws are enacted which skew the fruits of production or the economic pie towards elites. But you could have a more benign account in which elites still benefit, but they're just merely inattentive to it. So it could be globalization, tech-fueled growth, forms of production which focus on intellectual property or services and not on labor. So you could say that something occurred in the economy as a whole that caused this skewing that the elite colluded with, they enjoyed, they benefited from, but were passive rather than conspiring in it in the way that a medieval king might go and literally immiserate a serf. And I think that probably matters for how we try and avoid and undo this, and the kind of politics that we put in place to try and undo that. Is that a fair point?
Yes, it's a fair point, but I don't think this happens in the fit of absent-mindedness, because employers are very keenly aware of the wages that they pay to their workers, and one of their jobs, according to the neoclassical economics, is to increase the profits, from which, of course, they also profit. And therefore, it is an obvious thing. In fact, about 100 years ago, when the businessmen were much more frank about expressing their thoughts, you could read in industry magazines like the Iron Age or something like that. One factory owner writes, "I love to have a big crowd of Eastern Europeans in front of the gates of my factory because my workers walk by them and they see that if they demand more wages, we kick them out and grab one of those people." So they actually were saying this. And in fact, in the 19th century, businessmen induced the government to send recruiting crews and encourage immigration. And nowadays, businessmen, especially in the IT industry, they say, we need those educated people, all right? We have to import them because the United States does not produce enough education. Sorry, that is bullshit. because we are actually, the United States overproduces degrees even in STEM fields, science, technology, and so on. All right. So even though, of course, nobody is nowadays says it, but I bet that 90% of them are quite aware of this and use it in an instrumental way.
I want to take one further bite at this, if you don't mind. We agreed that we would have both a discussion and a debate in the course of it. So I get a model where you are paying X dollars an hour to produce motor cars in the United States. You move it to China or to Mexico and you pay a third of that, and you extract greater value and profit. And then those workers are displaced. Or if you have immigrant workers in modern democracies who you exploit because they live in the fringes of an economy, and that's a deliberate policy. Or you bust unions. I get both. I get and accept that. But the workers at Meta and at Google and at Apple, or the workers in professional services like lawyers or accountants or investment bankers, those firms don't seek to immiserate their employees. They are located in a sector of the economy where the fruits flow towards them for structural reasons. And so the elites there benefit by kind of showing up rather than by screwing people down in the kind of flow of the economy. And I think that matters because, in fact, some of those elites, and I think your work points to it, vote on the left. They become part of the social democratic crowd. They become the Democratic Party, and they become social democrats in Europe, and don't think of themselves as people who mistreat workers and think of themselves as more progressive, but they sit, collude at, and participate in economic models which point to this kind of skewed distribution. And I think that that's may be important because if you analyze that correctly, it may help direct us to palliative measures which are slightly different from the slap on the wrist, don't be a mean employer approach to things. Fair?
Yes, fair enough. And also, I don't want to say that all employers only care about the bottom line and things like that. In fact, there are many examples. We have a movement even of patriotic millionaires who are agitating for increasing taxes on themselves. There is Nick Hanauer, who has been writing these articles about the pitchforks are coming and things like that. So humans have, different people have different motivations. But as a group, they act in the interest of their class. I'm not a Marxist, but this is one observation that Marx has made.
Fine. So point 2 is the failing fiscal health and the declining legitimacy and efficacy of the state. Discuss.
Well, but let's first, since you brought up the elites, let's step back and talk about elite overproduction.
Okay, fine.
So I would be addressing, in fact, your question. So what is elites? Well, first of all, who are the elites? I use neutral sociological definition, simply small proportion of the population who concentrate social power in their hands. So these are like military nobility, let's say, in medieval England, or the Mandarin class in Imperial China, or the proverbial 1% in the United States. All right. So these elites concentrate 4 sources of power, which is coercive, economic, political or administrative, and ideological. Don't forget ideological. Very important, soft, but very powerful kind of power. Anyway, the next question becomes is how are elites recruited and rejuvenated, so to speak? Essentially, this requires a pool of people who want to occupy elite positions in business and politics, right? These are elite aspirants. Now, there is always more elite aspirants than positions, and some degree of competition is good because it weeds out the bad ones and less energetic and so on and so forth. But excessive competition is destructive. Because think about it, it's like a game of musical chairs, except you have you start with 10 musical chairs, but instead of removing chairs, you add more players. So when you have 12 players, you know, things are fairly manageable. When you get 20, things start to break down. When you get 30 or 40, you can imagine the chaos, all right? And so that's precisely what's happening. Now, how is that connected to the wealth pump? Well, we can think about most elites in Western democratic societies are a combination of economic and political elites. All right, so military elites are not as important as they used to be, let's say, in Middle Ages. All right, there are two pipelines leading to elite positions. One of them is wealth. You either inherit wealth or you acquire it. All right. The second one is holding the right degree, credentials, essentially. So both of these pipelines are operating. The wealth pump, now I think it's obvious why the wealth, how the wealth pump affects the wealth route. The more millionaires you have, the more people who want to translate, like Donald Trump is the best example, to translate their wealth into political position. And what we see in the United States, when the wealth pump got turned on during the 1970s, if you look at the number of people who, of wealthy people, super wealthy people, like people who have $10 million or more in inflation-adjusted terms, over the 40-period year of time, the numbers of these deca-millionaires increased tenfold, right? And so now, not all of them are going to seek office, but the more of them you have, that small proportion also is going to grow, and we see that very clearly. So that leads to this game of musical chairs, and as the numbers of elites trying to get in increases, the number of frustrated elites who don't get the positions grows even faster, and some proportion of them is tempted to start breaking the rules of the game. So if you try to play this game of musical chairs, I can bet you as soon as you get to 20 or 30 people per 10 musical chairs, there will be one individual who will do something sneaky like stand by a chair and while everybody's moving. And then people will figure it out. And so then now they will crowd a chair if you start pushing each other and then fist fights and so on. It will quickly escalate to chaos. And that's essentially why we see the degradation of the social norms and institutions governing elections in the United States.
So let's unpack that. Your argument is you have the wealth pump dramatically increases the size of the elite, but the elite aspirants. Elite aspirants.
Keep that, because the elites are still fairly fixed number of positions.
Right. But if you use your example in the United States of increasing the number of people who have 10 million in assets or more, are you saying that what produces conflict, because you say inter-elite conflict is one of the leading causes of disintegration, and you use an example of how conflict between elites then cause elites to mobilize people lower in the economic pyramid to fight on their behalf, and Trump is the classic example of being the billionaire or supposed billionaire, we don't know.
He's a billionaire counter-elite.
A billionaire counter-elite who mobilizes the grievances of people who are left out the system in order to fight elite games or preserve positions of power rather than to reconfigure the nature of a society. That analysis I find compelling in the case of Trump, and you could also deploy that in the sort of parts of the Tory right in relation to Brexit. That applies perfectly. But why does that elite fight each other? Why doesn't that elite just say, well, you turn on the pump, I'm kind of enjoying it. Why don't we just all have some kind of elite pact that we just keep things like we are? Because conflict is disruptive and produces winners and losers. What is it about your theory which says that in fact this isn't some wonderful homeostasis in this world?
Well, if you have lots of very ambitious people, all right, and if the majority of them get frustrated, then they typically, it is natural to perceive the problem. It's not your problem, right? It's the society. The society has become unjust. and therefore you want to, the motivations may not be very mercantile. The counter elites, in fact, typically they don't profess that I just want to throw this, elites out and occupy their position. No, and most of them think also that they are struggling against the unjust order. Now, because elite reproduction comes soon after immiseration, there is additional reasons to say that the society is horribly unjust, because people are going, to sleep hungry, and there are people, and so on and so forth, and therefore that feeds in also. All right. So it's so some people acquiesce to losing and just go away. All right. But other people who, when they lose, that only motivates them to redouble their efforts and use alternative ways of achieving their goals.
Okay, so to kind of fine-tune the argument, the elites overproduce. It produces competition amongst the elites. The elites then seek to secure their position by mobilizing people for political electoral purposes along a program which secures their sectional interests versus other members of the elite.
Yes, yes.
So I'm still...
Or also they could be genuinely trying to better the conditions of the people.
Aha. And so that would be saying I want a more egalitarian society, and I want to reconfigure the society in more egalitarian ways.
This society is unjust. And I want to change it, maybe overthrow this unjust social order and replace it with a much better one.
Okay. All right, I'm going to pause on that because we're going to come back to it. The third and the fourth are external conflicts, declining fiscal health, and the decline in the efficacy of the state being 3A and 3B. But go through those two.
Yeah, let's do it quickly, because so the state legitimacy declines because, first of all, the majority of the population is unhappy, and therefore they see that the country is on the wrong track. That's what Americans have been saying for the last couple of decades. And also at the elite level, we see these huge numbers of very bright and energetic people who are denied what they think should be their right. And that undermines the legitimacy of the state. The fiscal health of the state also typically gets hit because as the population gets immiserated, it becomes difficult to get taxes from them. And as elites start fighting each other, it leads to dysfunctional governance. And therefore, it is easy for some factions of elites to decrease taxes on themselves. All right, and there is it's a bit more involved than that, but that's we can go into that if you wish. And external circumstances, in fact, it's not just warfare. So let me introduce a very important thing. If you want to talk about the prediction, right? Let me just say that prediction about the future, especially, is very hard, as we know. So our complex systems, societies, are very difficult to predict in detail. So what we can do, we can focus on some features of these societies that, such as structural trends, such as immiseration and elite reproduction, that develop slowly, and because they're interconnected, they're somewhat predictable. But when we get to the crisis, like the breakout revolution or something like that, typically you need a trigger. And those triggers, let's think about the Arab Spring. Muazizi was immolated himself, and that triggered things off. But there are many people who immolated themselves before him, and that didn't trigger anything because structural conditions were not right. So you need to do. So there are limits to predictability. You have to focus on those things that actually are more predictable. All right. Now back to the just to finish with the external factors. Typically, they serve as triggers. So a defeat in external war, right? So in Russia, for example, that was a trigger for 1905 revolution. and also in 1917 revolution. Or sudden increase of inflation and the cost of food was a factor that played in the Arab Spring. And also the cultural and influences, like the Spring of Nations in 1848, it started in one state and it spread within like 6 months. All of Europe, apart from British Empire, was up in the revolutionary smoke.
Okay, so your book is called End Times, and you talk about the path of political disintegration. So your argument is you have the 4 factors, they begin to coalesce. I buy that in the US and in the UK, there are strong indicators that those are here. What then happens? What does the end of, what's the thing that we should be extraordinarily worried about that's about to happen that we should all be seeking to fend off? What does that disintegration look like? And is it a disintegration that's, what differentiates that from a bad cycle? I think what you're saying here is something worse than we're going to go through a slightly patchy bit and then it's going to self-correct. The book suggests this is end times.
Well, first of all, as usual, I did not come up with a title. It was my publisher. And so what I mean, and because I am by nature optimist, although with age I have become more realistic. I'm a realistic optimist. End times are also the times of new beginnings. So I certainly don't expect that we will all disappear in the next 10 years. The whole humanity will be, I hope not. And I think there's a very small chance of that. All right, so end times are also the times of new beginning. Here is where a science of history is particularly important. The thing is that the road to crisis tends to be quite channelized. It's amazing, in fact, how closely different societies, given, of course, all the differences between now and, in Middle Ages and between, let's say, China and US and so on. But at the more abstract level, in terms of those immiseration and elite reproduction, these are, especially elite reproduction, seems to be a ubiquitous factor. So it's like a ball running down the narrow valley, all right, and it really has no other place to go. But then you get to the crisis, and this is a cusp, and how different a series of potential roads out of the crisis open up. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have collected nearly 200 cases of crisis, and we see that the crisis outcomes extremely variable. For example, you can rank them, the severity of crisis, by whether population declines or even collapses, whether elites are exterminated or not, does the country fall apart, and things like that. And essentially, it's like a distribution. So in most cases, it's fairly dire, all right? Sometimes it's outright collapse, all right? Not as common nowadays than as it was, let's say, a couple of thousand years ago. But then there is this left-hand end of the distribution. 10–15% of crises end up without major bloodshed. And that is another reason for optimism. It is in principle possible to avoid really dire end times.
What percentage did you say?
10–15%. Okay.
And you're the optimist.
Yes.
Okay, so
the glass is 15% full.
Right. So let's take the US and the UK respectively, and follow your predictive model and see how strong the sort of likely to end in conflict or bloodshed. But you could make an argument that following Trump, and the specter of Trump may reemerge and is reemerging as we speak. But following Trump, you had Bidenomics, the Inflation Reduction Act, green industrial policy, a just green transition, seeking to kind of conjoin the two big challenges of our time, economic growth and the climate crisis. And you see Starmer literally taking a page from that book saying, I'll have that and I'm going to do that. And in a way, that is seeking to counteract some of the trends that you identified, seeking to ameliorate inequality, whether they will or won't is, I think, an open question, and seeking to broaden out the base of the economy in some interesting ways. So is there not, at least in modern democracies, this sort of self-correcting tendency, or is there something more sinister and more worrying that your book points to that we should be more alert to? And the reason I ask this question is because I think it alerts us to what we at the Conduit are trying to do is be clear-eyed about the nature of the challenge and then get ahead of the crisis before our societies get embroiled in death spirals, not least because this is a moment in time which it's unpropitious to be in a death spiral because we can't afford to waste the years that are necessary to address the climate crisis.
Well, unfortunately, I don't see any evidence that our political elites, in fact, anywhere, certainly in US or UK, have an understanding of how we got into this situation. Because they blame each other. The Republicans blame Democrats, Democrats blame Republicans. Now, the Bidenomics has not done the most important thing you have to do in order to get out of the crisis. You have to stop the wealth pump. It can happen either in a dramatic way, when a revolution, social revolution happens, and all the wealthy elites are exterminated or driven abroad, or it can happen in a more benign ways, but you have to stop the pump. There is no evidence of that. Look at real wages, for example. They've been flat, and in fact, they have again started to decline, this time because of the inflation. There is no evidence that things turn around. The new millionaires continue to be churned out. And I haven't talked much about the second route to elites, which is the credential route, right? But the new degree holders and especially lawyers continue to be churned out. And then AI actually comes after I finished my book, so it's not in the book. But AI is going to automate about half of what lawyers do. So right now in the United States, we overproduce lawyers 3 to 1. There are 3 times as many lawyers graduated every year compared to the positions they have. Now you have those positions, it will be 6 to 1. This is a very extreme game of aspirant chairs. All right. So, and that has not been really clearly understood that we have to deal with. Now, the AI has come for the elites. Before it was workers. The workers could be miserated for a while, then things will happen after a while, and economy may actually compensate in some way. But and this is probably going to happen with AI also. But for the next few years, when we are in extremely fragile situation, any push towards making situation worse can break the system. I mean, yes, democracy is much better than the alternatives. But, I don't go to sleep every night peacefully because I'm sure that democracy automatically will take care of all these types of things.
Well, no, I think, so now we're going to turn, and then I want to explore the remaining time in your and my conversation on this topic, and then we're going to turn to the audience. I am increasingly convinced that the current form of democracy and democratic practice, passive, procedural, liberal democracies, even ones that have separation of power, free media, human rights protections, are not fit for purpose, and that they are not responsive to the particular moment that we're in. And I think even the most, if I were a politician 5 years ago, I would have written a just green transition jobs plan, not unlike what Biden has done. And then I think I would be discovering with a sort of sickening feeling roundabout now that jobs plan, although it may help us get to net zero, and even there's some reason for cautious pessimism. If there's anything that's going to help us get there, it's this, but it's not going to produce the jobs at the bottom of the pyramid that we hoped it did. that we hoped it would. And I think the evidence is now mounting that the way that we're going to get to the just green transition is going to be driven by tech and by solar panels and by wind and by batteries and by molecular biology and by material science in ways that are not going to create jobs at the rate of displacement of AI at all. And even if they do, they're not going to be in the same place where you have coal miners or transport workers or retail workers who are going to be disrupted. So we're going to face a period of your immiseration that you speak about, where workers' real median wages are either flat or decline, and employment becomes a real problem. I think we're at the beginning of a deterioration, not an improvement on that. And if that is the case, the available policies that we are deploying, if we think the Just Green Jobs program is going to be the solution, I think it's probably going to be part of it, but a very incomplete one. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. So if we're trying to avoid an end times, and if your analysis tells us the sorts of things that cause societies to disintegrate, where have you seen examples, even historically, because let's look back into the past and your book is filled with those, where have you seen examples where elites turned this around without themselves being wiped out or capital being reappropriated and having these very violent moments of disruption? Because I suspect we don't want that. I mean, that may be what happens. We don't want that. So what are the good examples that give us clues about what we could be doing now?
Yes, I talk about four such examples. One of them is the progressive and New Deal period in the United States. Another one is the Chartist period in British Empire. I talk about the reform period in Russia in 1860s, which delayed revolution by about 50 years. And also, there is an example back in the distant past, during the early Roman Republic. Very similar things happened, and they managed to get it on the right track. So
and what did those things have in, I mean, each of them may be sui generis, but I suspect each of those things had something in common, which is why
they all turned off the wealth pump.
And how did they do that? Okay.
Yes, but so let's say that's the case study I know best is the progressive era and the New Deal. So many of the initiatives were proposed and even tried during the progressive era, and then set in stone more or less during the New Deal. And why current efforts are inadequate is because it's nothing compared to what the New Deal accomplished. The New Deal increased taxes on the wealthy. By 1960, the people with $1 million in income paid 90% of that income in taxes. Can you imagine that? Right? They introduced the minimum wage and kept rising it faster than inflation. And they gave workers power. Now, what's happening right now is that the taxes on the rich are only decreasing, thanks to Trump, partly. The minimum wage is, in real terms, is losing ground. The states are doing something, but the federal one is not. And the workers are getting their power taken away from them. I just saw one article, but apparently there is a decision by the Supreme Court that makes now, if workers go to strike, then it cannot materially damage the business, or otherwise, it becomes illegal. This was just one. I don't know yet. Take it with a grain of salt. I have to delve into this. But what happened? Left-leaning economists, mainstream but left-leaning economists, argue that workers losing power in the United States was really the root of why the wealth pumpers, or they don't call it the wealth pump, why they've been losing ground. And they've been doing it in a variety of ways, very sneaky ways, like there is this no competition clauses in contracts. It means that if you work for some industry and you want to leave to get a better wage, you can't, because the contract precludes you. You have to go to some other industry for which you have no skills. I mean, this is a naked exercise of power by employees. And so none of this, I don't see any of those trends turning around or even being seriously talked about. Why didn't Biden administration raise the minimum wage, for God's sake?
Okay, so the two core ideas are net increases in the wages of workers, a big effort to cause the wage levels of people in the bottom quartile of our society to have inflation-adjusted increases.
It's not just employment. The wages have to grow up together with the GDP per capita.
Fine. And then more progressive forms of taxation.
I think that would be inevitable to have some.
Okay.
Maybe not 90%.
So I suspect those will both cause, one of them will probably cause little or no debate in this crowd. One might cause some debate in this crowd. And then I think that the sort of big open question, and then with that I'm going to turn over to questions, is at least parts of that presuppose that periods of full employment in modern democracies are going to persist. And if we see periods of full employment no longer being the norm, if we see significant rises in absolute unemployment or rises in declines in labor market participation, people who choose to step out of the economy for reasons that we well understand, driven partly by the nature of the economy and driven partly by advances in technologies, then we're in a different economic paradigm that won't be responsive to those two suggestions, and we're going to have to come up with a third. And I might just leave that to float like a spectre out there unless you have an immediate response. Or should...
No, just to add to my New Deal example is that the country is very different. So we cannot just take and do the same things. We have to do something quite novel, including we have to deal with automation, the effect of automation.
Fine. Okay. A gentleman already has his hand up in the back.
Thank you very much indeed. And I certainly agree with you over the last 15 years that there's a real problem with the wealthy getting wealthier and everyone else not. But if you go back to 1800 until more or less the current time, since we got out of the Malthusian, before 1800 there was very little increase globally in people's living standards. And since then they've grown dramatically because of technological change, human capital investment, people thinking differently about their children, educating them, and also, of course, formation of capital. And I worry about what you are saying, because if you don't have those elites who are going to cause those things to set the structures to enable that kind of technological growth, you can't get growth in income. To me, the question more is around, I love your thoughts on this, on how do you move these elites from being too much on the extractive towards the inclusive? And I like your examples because it has happened before in a blip. And everyone's talking about this, right? That's why we're here. Yeah. And I'm surprised that is it really as bad as 10 or 15% given that?
Sorry, I missed the last part.
Is it really as bad as 10 or 15% chance given that?
I think more than that, because at least we have a better understanding of how we got into this predicament and how we need to get out of it. So I actually agree with what you're saying. Please don't conclude from what I say is that we have to get rid of the elites. This is anarchist idea, and it's I know no large-scale society that has been governed by an anarchist principles. It doesn't work. No, we need the elites. We need managers. We need thought leaders. We need, all those people who are good at organizing things and occupy the important positions. But we want pro-social elites who are working for the benefit of the whole population rather than for the narrow benefit of the ruling class. And remember that during these integrative phases, this actually tends to be the case. Even back in the medieval and so on times, like during the Chinese dynasties, one dynasty collapses, a new one comes in, They care about peasants. They make sure that they have enough land. They build up granaries to carry them over during the famines, and so on and so forth. They've been doing it for 2,000 years. And then, when the integrative phase gets to a close, the selfish elites again come to the fore and destroy everything. So we need the elites, but somehow we have to constrain them to act to the benefit of all. And in the past, that has been done either by a violent overthrow of one elite class and a new one coming in, or by elites getting so frightened. In all these 4 cases that I gave you of successful outcomes, there was a very strong element of fear, because the elites essentially, Alexander II told the nobility in 1860 or so, we either have reforms from above or revolution from below. FDR said something very similar to that.
And Obama said something similar, as quoted in your book, saying, I'm the only person to a bunch of bankers standing between you and the pitchforks. And it's strange to have Obama cast as an agent of the elite, protecting the elite against the pitchforks, unless the elite agrees to change, which I think is possibly part of the critique of the Democratic Party in the United States, which it seeks to place itself in the position of working people, but its policies, certainly under Clinton or Blair in the UK, actually exacerbated the pump. The
Democrats were a party of working people during the New Deal. Yeah. I mean, and then, especially, yes, Clinton moment was that turning point when they became much more center.
I'm going to ask for other questions. Lady in the back.
Thank you very much. You spoke about AI and more people being unemployed. What role do you think universal basic income plays in this whole ecosystem, and is it going to become mainstream?
Well, so any kind of specific proposals. First of all, I'm not a politician, I'm a scientist. Secondly, I want to want to be honest with you. Our models are better than what we had before, because they seem to be capturing important parts of the reality, and they can be, to a certain degree, predictive, right, giving the caveats that I said. But they are imperfect. So what we really need, we need to invest more in developing these types of science. As I said at the beginning, we need to worry about the health of societies, and how do we get better health of societies? By getting much better science. So specifically to your question about UBI, there is a lot of arguments. Some people have brought potential negative effects. So because human societies are nonlinear systems, right, there could be unexpected consequences of even motivated actions. So what we need, I cannot tell you whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. We need to put that into models and run them and see what would be the effect.
On the 10 to 15% thing, Peter, the British have been famous for the last 500 years of muddling through, and they haven't sort of had revolutions and so on since then. Is it something to do with the British, or did they just get lucky with having an empire and then an industrial revolution?
Yeah.
Sorry, repeat that.
Did they just get lucky? So the British have been good for the last 500 years and just muddling through without revolutions.
Yeah.
Did they just get lucky, or is it something to do with empire or colonialism?
Yeah, so here we go back. So this revolution or civil wars tend to happen at a roughly 200-year period, right? Again, it's not perfect mathematical cycles. So the previous wave was the age of revolutions, starting in 1789 and lasting until 1860s or so. And in fact, the United States had a civil war. China had the worst civil war in history, when 50 million people probably died in the Taiping Rebellion, but British Empire didn't. All right, and so I actually spent a substantial chunk in the book analyzing this, why that happened. Well, first of all, British Empire was somewhat lucky. They flattened the curve, so to speak, because they could export some of the surplus labor, all right, which enabled them to ameliorate the disbalance between labor supply and demand. And they also exported a lot of surplus elites who took positions in the empire or, you know, started businesses in the empire, whatever. Excuse me. But that was not enough. That was enough to flatten the curve. So then they put together, it was quite actually dire situation. Remember Peterloo massacre? There was all kinds of really nasty things going on. So they realized the situation was pretty dire. And once, what's his name, Duke Wellington, who had a lot of power, the guy who won, you know, in 1815 Waterloo. When they pushed him out because he was just a horrible conservative, then they were able to get a coalition together. They repealed the corn laws. You know, they allowed workers to organize, and they did all kinds of things. And so what they accomplished was that prior to 1850, for about a century, even though United States was industrializing rapidly from 1750s and on, right, the real worker wages were going down. And but after they have taken all those steps, which took like several decades really to implement, for the next 100 years, the real wages grew very rapidly together with the economy. So they basically turned off the wealth pump. Wait for that.
Mine's a bit more of an open question, but I remember when you were talking about the 4 types of power, you mentioned ideological as well. And I'd just love to learn a little bit more about that. Also taking into consideration things like social media and what that means for how you influence people. So, yeah, very open question, but I'd love some more insight.
Yeah, it's very important. So in ideological power, for example, there are some theocracies, you know, Iran, for example, where it is the ideological leaders who are really the ultimate leaders. And it's rare to have such situations. In the United States, ideological power was thoroughly controlled by the plutocrats, essentially because they owned the newspapers and things like that. So one helpful, I think, sign is that as a result of new social media now, you know, so Tucker Carlson, you may like him or dislike him, but he was criticizing the ruling class. And many of things he said would actually parallel what I say in my book, all right, about the ruling class and that workers were abandoned. So he got fired. But just yesterday, he's now on a Twitter platform or something like that. And of course, others. There's a whole coterie of new muck-raking journalists like Matt Taibbi, you know, Glenn Greenwald, and so on, who have been pushed out from corporate media, but they have created their own platforms and they're more influential. That is the great thing. You know, they actually get more views and everything than, CNS, whatever, MSNBC and CNN and so on and so forth. So that is actually a good way in which technology is changing the landscape. And ideological power is very important because it's much more subtle. It's soft, but one social media influencer can reach millions of people and change their minds, and that could push the pressure from grassroots on our politicians, something that we really need.
So you had your hand up, yeah?
I wonder whether there is something to do with aging populations as well, which may have an effect as well as people seek to give away wealth. And if they knew when they were going to die and the age and people's life expectancy was clearer, then you might see some reverse of these things going on in different forms. Maybe that 10 to 15% becomes a slightly bigger number.
Yeah, actually, I talk about age in my book, but where I have much more opportunity to talk about different things. So age, dynamics of age structure is very important. You may have heard the term the youth bulge. So youth knowledge was extremely important in the Arab Spring, for example. All right. And in the United States, we had a big youth knowledge in late 60s, early 70s, which resulted in a lot of, political and social turbulence, but there was no, at that point, there was no immiseration whatsoever. So all those college students, like the weathermen underground, they wanted to trigger the revolution, but the workers were not interested. Things were doing well. They were doing better than their parents. All right. So we had some of this age bulb during the 20 teens. Now it's subsiding. So that's one of the reasons why situation may not get too dire, because revolutions, revolutionary troops at least, have to be young and willing to, to risk their lives. So, so this is very important factor.
I'm going to take a final question just because we're running out of time. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. Peter, arguably one defining insight of your scientific research is that competition between groups is a key driver of the evolution of cooperation. In the backdrop of the troubling demographic trends you've detailed is a troubling geopolitical trend. That's the rising tensions between the United States and China. What do you make of these rising geopolitical tensions? Or to put it another way, would a large-scale military confrontation reverse some of these trends, but perhaps ironically resulting in another end time?
Well, yeah, that's the potential there for World War III nuclear. Now that would be could be death of all of us. I hope it won't happen. Yeah, thanks, because what I'm talking about here in this book, it's really only half of my research, because the other half is I'm very interested how these wonderful large-scale complex societies that are in principle capable of delivering high quality of life for all, how did they evolve in the first place? They're quite new. For 95% of our evolutionary history, we lived in small, humans, Homo sapiens, lived in small-scale societies. So I have another book called Outer Society where I talk about this. And warfare turns out to be a very important explanatory factor. So the difference is that competition within groups is destructive of cooperation. Competition between groups actually promotes cooperation. All right, so if you want the details, that's in that book. And so what we have now, if United States and China don't start throwing A-bombs, what certainly is happening already, the Chinese are all getting behind their leaders who in fact have broken some social norms, like Xi was supposed to be out, but he is still in, right? So, but the external pressure is always mobilizing support for the regime. And that's what is happening almost in any war. Now, if a country loses war, that can be a trigger for a breakout of revolutionary civil war or something like that. But winning war legitimizes the regime further, and even if other structural conditions are pretty bad, that extends the life of the regime. And of course, our leaders, unfortunately, know this, and so they've been using this war, type thing as a device to mobilize population behind them. Ronald Reagan, once he was talking with Mikhail Gorbachev, and they were exploring how Russia and the Soviet Union could cooperate better, and Reagan suggested, well, if you get attacked by Martians, then I'm sure that we will be able to cooperate better. So it is a factor. But even though empirically warfare has been a huge driver of progress, I hope that we can abolish it. We have to abolish it. This is one of the serious problems that we have not yet solved. And we can continue having competition within societies, but taking, non-violent forms, like firms competing in the marketplace. That's a wonderful mechanism for weeding out the bad businesses and rewarding good businesses. So something like that, I hope, will happen to the international landscape.
So I'm going to end on a sort of optimistic conduit note, if I may. And that is, and I think it fits with your analysis, and it grafts onto a form of optimism which I think is legitimate. And that is, if you buy the argument that a lot of conflict is driven by elite overproduction and then elite competition, and then you buy the second argument you said is that elites change their behavior either if they're pitchforked or they're fearful. Fear can come from violence, but fear can also come from organizing.
And foresight.
Right. And so I think what it does is it gives space for entrepreneurs, researchers, policymakers, and citizens' movements to galvanize in this rather scary moment we're in, where we have some ideas about what a more just and a more sustainable world might look like. And there's some things where I think even in the conversation today, we're still feeling ourselves towards a proper and adequate response for what is almost certainly going to happen in the next decade or so. And so I think being able to organize, being able to think, being able to gather together people as pressure groups, and then to carve out solutions and have that division of labor between organization and fear, and then solutions in engagement with elites, then I think offers a pathway out of this. And that then I think returns us from positions of passivity to positions of a kind of enlightened activism. And I think that's why we're here. None of us want an end of time, so you can blame that on your publisher. And I'm very grateful for your conversation as always. And hang out, have a drink. There's some really cool things happening on the roof. Shelter is doing some work with IKEA on approaches to deal with homelessness. Client Earth was here all of today talking about climate litigations to try and deal with the climate crisis. So please hang out, have a drink, and keep the conversation going. Thank you for coming.
And